Hello and welcome back to the Liv Label Free podcast. Today's episode is a little bit different because it's not a solo episode and it's not me interviewing a guest, but instead, I am being interviewed. This conversation was initially released on the Neurospiced, and yes, that's spiced as in SPICED, such a clever play on words, podcast presented by EDNA, which is short for Eating Disorders Neurodiversity Australia, and is a podcast sharing neurodivergent voices with lived experience of eating disorders. After listening to the published episode when it was released back in January of this year, I thought it was such a powerful conversation that I later reached out to the host, Lawrence, asking her if she could send me the audio file so that I could reshare it on the Liv Label Free podcast. In this episode, I share my journey growing up undiagnosed autistic, how this led to the development of my eating disorder, and then I really dive into the dangers of traditional eating disorder treatment for neurodivergent individuals. I talk about gaslighting and how this conditioned me to mask in my conversations with professionals, how this invalidation led me to manipulate the treatment system, and I dive into several other topics that are important when it comes to the link between neurodiversity and eating disorders. Of course, I also share what did work for me to fully recover from an eating disorder while embracing my unique brain, so hopefully you will feel empowered and inspired to do the same. Before we dive in, I just want to give two quick book updates. First of all, my cookbook, Nourishing Neurodiversity, is officially published. Nourishing Neurodiversity contains over 50 easy recipes that are vegan, gluten-free, soy-free, nut-free, and 100% customizable to your sensory needs and preferences. The entire book is also filled with executive functioning tips, gut health tips, and information on how to improve mental health. Suffice to say, the book lives up to its name of helping you nourish your neurodiversity. So grab yourself a copy, and if you know someone who's neurodivergent, grab them a copy too. One of the reasons I created this book is because it's the cookbook I wish I had when I was learning to eat in a way that aligned with my unique needs. So if you can help get it into the hands of more people who need that, we can advocate for neurodiversity together. You'll also hear me mention my second book several times throughout this episode, and that is my memoir, Rainbow Girl. It will be released in a few months and is truly the most vulnerable and unfiltered account of my life I have ever shared. I dive even deeper into several of the topics covered in the upcoming podcast, so if you like what you hear, you will absolutely love my book, Rainbow Girl. You can be the very first to hear when it's published by signing up for my book waitlist at livlabelfree.com/book. And if you'd like to get Rainbow Girl and Nourishing Neurodiversity and all of my future books completely for free, yes, for free, you can become a Liv Label Free patron by visiting the link livlabelfree.com/Patreon, and that's Patreon spelled Patreon. Now, without further ado, let's dive into this episode with Lawrence.
Gotta put one foot in front of the other, and you'll be around the corner soon.
Welcome to Liv Label Free, the podcast, where you'll learn to let go of limiting labels and embrace your unique brain. As my mom says so beautifully in her song,
Fear is a heavy load to carry.
which is why on this podcast, you'll learn the scientific links between neurodiversity and eating disorders, giving you a deeper understanding of how you can face your fears and become truly free. Together, you and me, we will keep putting
One foot in front of the other.
Hi, Livia. It's lovely to have you on our podcast tonight. Can you tell me a bit more about yourself in general?
Yeah, well, I'm super, super excited to be here because as we were talking about before we started recording, I actually reached out to you after I had read your story online and was like, wow, this resonates so deeply with my life story growing up, being diagnosed with an eating disorder while unknowingly autistic. And I had remember reaching out to you and I hadn't heard back because somehow the message ended up in your spam folder or something like that.
Yeah, I'm sorry
And
for
then
that.
no worries. And then like I don't even know how much later, but more than half a year later, you reached out to me to be on the Neurospiced podcast, and I was like, wow, I love that this like comes full circle and it was like meant to be. So yeah, anyways, like I just said, I was diagnosed with an eating disorder at quite a young age, when I was 11 years old. And growing up, I mean, I always knew that I was different. Like I would pretend to like girly things even though I really didn't, just so I would fit in and just so I would have quote unquote friends.
Yeah, a bit
Um,
like feeling like an alien and feeling like you've been dropped on this planet and you don't belong really.
Yeah, that's, like, literally how I describe it in my book that's coming out this year too, is, like, I felt like I was dropped, like, on a planet, and I was like well, I think I use a metaphor, like, I felt like I was dropped in a video game that I wasn't supposed to be or, like, one of those characters that's like, "This is really
And
not
everybody
correct."
knows the rules and they can apply them and like be functional. And then you're like, what are the rules? But
Yeah,
nobody wants to
exactly.
tell you.
Yes, and the interesting is when you use that word functioning is like when I look back at my childhood and especially school and sports, like I was very functioning. Like I received very, very high grades. I was a very well performing student in school. I did all the sports. I was the fastest in the track team. I scored all the goals in soccer. You know, I was high competitive gymnast. I think when everyone looked at me from the outside, I was like the epitome of some little girl that was, you know, bound for success. But
Yeah.
I think deep inside, I was very, very unhappy. I was constantly living in fear. I was always anxious. And I felt this intense pressure to perform, right? Especially because I had kind of been conditioned, like, we expect this from you.
Yeah.
And I think when those underlying autism that you have no idea about, especially because no one learns like that's not part of the school curriculum, right? Like
Yeah.
what is autism? And if it is, it's along that same stereotypes that you see with eating disorders of
Yeah.
like I remember so clearly in like the biology textbook we were learning about anorexia and bulimia and binge eating disorder, like as if those are the only three eating disorders. And I just remember this graphic in that book of anorexia, of a very thin skeletal girl looking in the mirror and seeing a fat person staring back at her.
Mhm.
So
Which
when I
is
was
very,
diagnosed,
very stereotypical and
right,
stigmatizing as well, because it gives the message to fat people that they are not worthy as such, and it's very
yes,
traumatizing for fat people to feel the way that they are somebody's worst nightmare essentially. So that
right.
image really needs to go because it's very stigmatizing for people living in larger bodies.
Absolutely, and especially, like, one of the terms that I just do not like is that term atypical anorexia
Yeah,
because
I'm the same. Yeah,
the fact that it's called atypical, I'm like, first of all, more people have anorexia in larger bodies, I personally believe, but because they're in larger bodies, they're not getting diagnosed with anorexia.
yeah,
And
because
then
there's
also
that
that
assumption that you're not sick enough.
right, right, which is, like, already so prominent when you have an eating disorder,
Yeah.
and then by naming it atypical, it's like, "Oh, it's not real, like, I'm not
Actually,
allowed to."
atypical anorexia is statistically more prevalent than typical anorexia.
Yeah, exactly, and I personally don't really like statistics because I feel like there's so many people going undiagnosed, and the only people that are part of the statistic are the people that actually are recognized, right?
Yeah.
So anyways, when I was 11 or 12, kind of going back to my story, I was diagnosed with anorexia and depression, and OCD and so many other things. And I just remember for years denying, like, I do not have anorexia, I do not have this, because I didn't have body dysmorphia, I didn't have fear of fatness, I didn't have fear of weight gain. I didn't have any of these things that all the therapists and healthcare professionals were basically stuffing down my throat, like, oh, you have body image issues, oh, you have this, but I was like, no, I don't, so I can't have anorexia.
Hmm.
And because I had that, I think very visually, I had always that image of my mind of like, an anorexic person is someone who's very thin, looks in the mirror and thinks they're fat. I'm like, I don't have this, so I cannot have anorexia. So I think that is kind of where the invalidation started, of like me telling my parents, I do not have this, I do not resonate with this, and them basically all saying, no, you do, you are this thing, you are this label. Um,
It's
and
almost
that
like
that
gaslighting as well. It distorts your own narrative and your own feelings within yourself of how you feel about like your eating disorder.
It, absolutely, yeah. So suffice to say, kind of long story short, for over 7 years, I was forced in and out of treatment for my eating disorder. Every time in treatment, being the quote unquote perfect patient, eating all the things, like following all the rules, and then as soon as I got out, I would just spiral back into the behaviors because I was like, you guys can't control me. But that just caused me to bounce back and forth the whole time, and
Hmm.
um also during treatment, I learned a lot of methods to, I guess, manipulate the system. So first of all, I learned how to mask for my therapist and for my nutritionist, and I basically learned what language they wanted me to use. And so if they say like, oh, you have a hard time eating a cupcake because you're afraid of it, I would be like, okay, I'm gonna store that for the next appointment. And the next appointment, when they'd be like, why didn't you gain weight, I'd say, I was so afraid of the cupcake, so that's why. And they'd be like, wow, I'm so proud you're being honest with me. And it kind of
Yeah.
conditioned me to lie just to get through treatment, I guess.
Yeah.
um I would hide food, I would do secret exercise. I mean, I figured out any way to kind of prove to myself, I guess, like no one can tell me what to do.
Hmm.
And I think that is obviously what made the eating disorder much more ingrained, because I found all these secret ways to get through, to manipulate the system. And it reached one point where I was water loading, and I, for almost a year, I made my weight go up on the curve in an almost flawless fashion, by every week drinking extra water basically,
Hmm.
and putting coins in my underwear, and just it got to a point where I almost manipulated my weight by 6 kilograms or something like that. So
Hmm.
for a small 15-year-old girl, like, that is very significant.
Yeah.
And I just remember when I was caught, because I had peed all over the scale at the doctor's office because I couldn't hold it anymore. It was like, this has gotten too serious. Like, this is the worst case of manipulation I've ever seen. Um, After that, I was again forced in and out of treatment, and 2 years later, it got to a point where my psychiatrist said, you like, your case is too complex. You're just going to have to accept the fact that you're never going to get better. Now I don't understand why, even if it was true, why anyone would say that to a 15-year-old girl.
Hmm.
Uh, but anyways,
Especially
after
when it's
that,
actually their fault that they cannot properly diagnose you with autism in the first place, and they're
yeah,
treating you in a way that is harmful for yourself.
exactly.
and
So
and they
after
didn't
that,
consider the demand avoidance as well, because you mentioned that like control, you didn't want people to control you and you want to have autonomy and stuff like that. That's pretty
yeah.
relevant in terms of demand avoidance, which I mean psychiatrists technically should be aware of.
Yeah, especially when it comes to autism, because I think autistic people already have so much distrust in the world that when you're in treatment or any kind of like mental health care, like, establishing that trust is essential.
Yeah.
So if you're doing the opposite and you're creating this like hierarchical kind of system, I'm like, it's bound to create trauma basically. So yeah, after that, I was completely given up on. I was tossed out of any kind of healthcare system. And that's when things got like their worst, to a point in 2017 where I literally was on the edge of death. But it was during one of my panic attacks, that I remember laying on my bed screaming and crying and saying, I cannot do this anymore. There has to be a better way. Like, it was either I was going to do something radically different and give living a chance, or I wanted to die. Like,
Mhm.
it was those two options. So in 2017, I was like, I'm going to give this whole recovery thing everything I've got, and I don't care if, well, of course I did care, but I was like, I don't care if this is going to be so scary, because I knew it was, because I mean that's why I clung to my eating disorder, right? Because it was safe and it was
Mhm.
predictable, and
Yeah,
every basically autistic trait manifested in food and exercise, what was my eating disorder.
it was kind of
um
your special interest in some way.
Yeah, like that's how I describe it in my book too, like how when I was 11 and or 12, and when I was diagnosed with the eating disorder, healthy eating became my special interest.
Yeah. That's
But
why it's so dangerous to apply moral values to food items. Like, this is healthy, this is unhealthy, and then autistic people with black and white thinking, they go like, oh, this is
yeah.
healthy, I should just eat that, and then it becomes so ingrained, and then it becomes a special interest, and that's risky.
Yeah, and the literal thinking too, because
Exactly. Yeah.
when I was in fifth grade, so when I around the time I started developing the eating disorder, we learn in school, right? An apple is healthy, a cookie is unhealthy. All these things about like childhood obesity and diabetes and heart attacks, and I literally believed like, oh, if I eat cookies, I am going to get diabetes.
Yeah.
So it was like, okay, no cookies for me. But of course that reached a point where it became an eating disorder. So
Yeah.
anyways, in 2017, I committed to full recovery, and it came with its ups and downs. And it was really hard, but I gained the weight that was necessary. And my mental health got a lot better. But 3 years later, so in 2020, well, like all throughout that time of me being in like real recovery, I guess, or like real striving to live, I don't really like the term recovery very much.
Mhm.
Um, is there was always something missing. I was doing better and I had gained the weight, but there were still so many quote unquote what I now refer to as autistic eating disorder behaviors that were still very present. But I was like, I'm not engaging in eating disorder anymore, and I don't want this eating problem anymore. But so why am I still so focused on numbers? Why do I still have difficulty with hunger cues? Why do I still have these really strong preferences for food temperatures and textures and all these things that
Mm.
professionals are saying are my eating disorder? It just didn't make sense. And I was like, there's something much deeper than this that no one is seeing, that someone is missing.
Yeah.
So interestingly, now I kind of just want to get into like how my autism discovery story. And in 2015, so around the time that I was told like you're too complex, you're never gonna get better.
Oh, we all
One
got that message.
Oh yeah.
It's
Yeah.
crushing and it's devastating, like, to be told that, oh well, you're too unwell, you're too complex, we don't really care anymore about you, bye.
Right. And I think I've thought a lot about why healthcare professionals say that, and the conclusion I've come to and believe in is that they're humans too, humans with fears and limiting beliefs. And I think by blaming their inability to help on the patient,
Yeah,
it lets them off the hook.
it makes them feel
They
better
don't.
about themselves, but
Yeah,
eventually
exactly.
they cause trauma to vulnerable people, which is
Exactly.
not very ethical, especially when they get paid to help you and they don't.
Oh, oh yeah, especially that. And don't even get me started on the whole money part of this off,
Yeah.
because like all the statistics based on like this many people with anorexia also have autism. Like I actually dove deep into the studies, and this is another book I plan on writing. Like
Hmm.
all of these statistics are based off stereotypical thin white woman
Yeah,
with access to treatment, like, or
exactly.
with like insane insurance, which in the US is just non-existent if you're not wealthy.
Mm.
Yeah, it's very large problem. But and I mean, I have thin privilege. Like I did fit that stereotype, so I did have access to treatment. But yeah, that's a whole nother rabbit hole that I'm not gonna get into. um But yeah, anyways, I'm gonna go back to where I started in 2015. Yeah, like around that same time when I was told I was too complex, a friend of my mom's who actually was a therapist who worked with neurodivergent people, she at one point had suggested like I think Livia may be on the spectrum. Like, I think she has Asperger's, which
Yeah.
I know that term isn't being used anymore, but she had recommended my mom read the book Asperger's by Rudy Simone.
Mhm. I
So
heard
my
about it, yeah.
mom yeah, so my mom had like all these books in her shelf, like How to Help You Teen Beat an Eating Disorder and um parenting a child with an eating disorder. You know, all the
Yeah.
books that a parent wants to solve the problem. So my mom had all these books, including the book Asperger's. But because at the time, I think I mean, so many people believe like autism is that stereotype. Like I still get that
Like you
every
lack
day when I
empathy,
see,
you don't make eye contact,
yeah,
and you cannot have friends, you cannot be good at school, and all those like
yes,
unrealistic
exactly.
and stupid
Like
stereotypes.
still when I say I'm autistic, people are like, "How is that even possible? Like you're fine in
You
social
don't look
situations."
autistic.
Yeah, I'm like, okay, I'm not even getting into this.
Yeah.
I wrote a whole book about this, 85,000 words. So, that's what I have to say about that.
Yeah.
But yeah, anyways, I was like very resistant to this new label. I was like, I already am diagnosed anorexia and depressed and OCD and anxiety. I'm like, the last thing I need is another label. But then when I was feeling like something was missing, and after I had actually started my Liv Label free coaching program, my very first client actually, she was autistic. And I had asked her like, what caused you to reach out to me? Why did you start coaching with me? And she had said like, well, I read your story on your website about you being labeled as too complex and all these kind of non-compliant labels, right?
Yeah.
And she said, and that really resonated with me, and everyone had given up on me. And your just story and your approach really resonated with me. And so I started working with this girl, and a lot of what she was describing, like how she had these very sensory preferences and difficulty with hunger cues and basically all the things that I still experience. um I was like wow, maybe this whole autism thing that 5 years prior, um maybe there is something in that. So I went into my mom's room, I got the book Asperger's, and I started reading it. And I have never read a book that fast in my entire life, because from the very first page, I was like, this is so me. Like, this is insane. No one has ever described me so accurately before.
Yeah.
And kind of the rest is history. Because then I discovered I'm autistic, and I really started basically every kind of approach to recovery from my eating disorder that was like still like I was almost there, but I wasn't completely there. I always say like if my recovery from an eating disorder was like baking a cake, the autism discovery was like the cherry on top. Like that was like the last thing I needed to really go over that edge of like now you've fully recovered.
Hmm.
Because I could stop labeling certain preferences and certain traits as eating disorder behaviors, and I could now see them as autistic traits that are just part of who I am,
Yeah.
and allowing those things to be there, allowing me to microwave my coffee 5 times if I need to, and not having it be an eating disorder behavior. Like that made me realize like I am recovered, and these things that all the time the healthcare professional said those are eating disorder behaviors. I was like, well, not in my case. In my case, they're actually just preferences that I have, and allowing that to exist and be there, and no longer focusing negative energy on it.
Yeah.
That I believe is allowing me to fully live my life.
Yeah.
And I think that's why I don't really like the word recovery very much. Because I always say like where your attention goes, energy flows. And if you're so focused on like, am I doing recovery perfectly? Like how do I like if you're so focused on recovery from your eating disorder, like you will stay stuck in recovery from your eating disorder. But the point of recovery from your eating disorder, of course, is not recovery. It's to live your life.
Yeah.
um so yeah, so basically embracing all these traits that at first were eating disorder behaviors allowed me to fully live my life. let's take a moment to talk about snacks. If you are listening to this, chances are you struggle with reliable hunger cues, and you are not alone. Neurodivergent individuals, as well as those who struggle with anxiety or disordered eating, tend to lack interoceptive awareness, which is responsible for sending us bodily cues, including whether we're hungry, thirsty, or in pain. As a neurodivergent individual myself, I know firsthand what it feels like to be so out of touch with your body that come nighttime, you realize you are so hungry and just want to binge on the entire kitchen. But I can assure you that even though you may currently feel stuck in a toxic cycle of confusion, it is possible to learn to nourish your body and neurodivergent brain in a way that fits your unique lifestyle. An essential part of doing so is by incorporating nutritious snacks, and that's why I am so excited to tell you about Midi Bites. Midi Bites is a women-owned business that creates refrigerated cookie bites for adults and kids alike. Founded by a holistic nutritionist and kids nutrition specialist, the woman behind Midi Bites was on a mission to create a snack made from only the highest quality whole food ingredients, and has succeeded in doing so with her products that are all organic, vegan, gluten-free, soy-free, and completely free of preservatives or any other junk that's in most bars or snacks these days. The chocolate cookie bites and the entire line of kids cookie bites are also 100% nut-free, so these conveniently packed bites are truly a snack or dessert the entire family can enjoy. To snag your bites and get a whopping 20% off your order, simply head over to midibites.co and enter my code LIV20 at checkout. So that's MIDIBITES.co, and my code LIV20, LIV20, gets you 20% off your entire order. Be sure to tell me your favorite flavor, and now let's get back to today's episode.
Something that health professionals miss completely, like they think that like normal autistic behaviors are actually eating disorder behaviors, and they try to cure or treat them, which is actually harmful because they're not eating disorder related behaviors, they're autistic related behaviors, and those behaviors, they help with self-regulation, self-soothing. And so I guess in your case, it sounds like your understanding of autism for yourself in terms of self-awareness has led to self-acceptance, which then triggered your recovery, I guess.
Exactly, yeah. And so the more and more I really learned, like embracing the autism it is what makes me so much stronger and so much more confident. That's when I actually really started shifting like all the work I was doing online with Liv Label Free into like bridging that gap between neurodiversity and eating disorders, because I was discovering that there was a whole world of people out there who were struggling with the same thing and had very similar stories to mine, and there's this huge need for people with lived experience that can help people recover from their eating disorders and live that full life while embracing their autism. So yeah, this story kind of got really long, but that's basically my why for doing what I do today, and that is helping neurodivergent individuals fully recover from their eating disorder. Because I know how important it is to have that holistic approach and that validation and just basically being allowed to be yourself. Because if you're gonna look everywhere outside yourself and try and fit this mold that you were never supposed to fit in anyway, like how do you ever expect to be yourself? I always say, like, if you're enslaved to your environment and your external circumstances, like slavery is the very opposite of freedom. So how can you ever have any kind of freedom, right? If you're trying to live a life that isn't actually yours. So yeah, that's kind of my story and why I'm here today.
I mean, I can relate to your struggles as well, like in terms of being labeled too complex and like people somehow giving up on you and your autistic traits that help you actually live your life being medicalized and pathologized and trying to be cured, and then you end up fighting yourself rather than the eating disorder itself, because if you try to fight your autism, then you fight yourself, and there's no point in that except being harmed. So
Exactly. Yeah,
trying
and
to
it's very
accept,
traumatic.
yeah, accept myself. Like I have food preferences, very strong ones, and that's fine. That's okay. It's not eating disorder behavior. It's autistic behavior, and I have to embrace it because otherwise I'll never recover from my eating disorder.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
And it would
So
be nice for health professionals to actually like understand that. So how do you think your neurodivergence has affected the development of your eating disorder and its maintenance as well?
yeah, so I think I recently touched on like a lot of I think the reasons why undiagnosed autism made my eating disorder worse. But I think first of all, it's really important to recognize that there are a lot of like autistic traits that when they manifest into food and exercise and it gets very like extreme, I guess that basically is like the recipe for an eating disorder. So
Hmm.
for example, we talked about like that literal thinking, right? The taking health recommendations very literally.
Yeah.
I remember being told like you have to eat this to be healthy, or you have to exercise for this much time each day to be healthy. And just like back when we had the food pyramid still, I was like, oh, well, oil is such a slim part of this pyramid. Why not just like cut it out, right? And trying to be very perfectionistic in how I approach these recommendations and the whole healthy eating and everything became a special interest of mine. So yeah, I always say like, and I personally believe that my eating disorder was simply a manifestation of my autism.
Mhm.
Um, and I think it also, a lot of it has to do with anxiety. Because I'm pretty sure that every single autistic person also has anxiety. And I think that has to do with the that we're conditioned to not be able to trust the world. Because
And
I once heard a
ourselves as
quote.
well.
Yes, because I once heard a quote that was super powerful, and I think it's like really I think trust is the core of basically kind of any kind of mental health issue, is distrust. And one quote that I once heard that I loved about anxiety was the opposite of anxiety isn't calm, it's trust. And I think that is why so many autistic people do have anxiety is because we don't trust ourselves, we don't trust the external world, we don't trust what we're supposed to do, we don't, and that's why we mask and use all these kind of coping mechanisms. And another thing that I think is really interesting is when people say that autistic people are very fixed and rigid in how they think, I actually think it's the complete opposite. I actually think that autistic
Yeah.
people are very flexible and open to new opportunities, but because we then are so overwhelmed by the abundance of choices and opportunities, we become paralyzed. Um, and to protect us from that analysis paralysis, to protect us from the anxiety that comes with that overwhelm, we're like, okay, we'll just do this one thing all the time without fail because at least we know what to expect then.
Yeah.
So yeah, that kind of perspective like really changed my mind on like, wow, that's actually so interesting. And I think it just goes to show that autistic people are actually very resourceful in finding coping mechanisms to protect
Absolutely.
themselves. But it has caused them to, I guess, appear like a certain way in a world that wasn't built for us.
Hmm.
So yeah, I think like I said, a lot of it has to do with anxiety. That there are a lot of overlapping traits that we also touched on before, like very strong preferences for texture and temperatures and how food looks and how food feels. And not wanting to feel very full because that can be very uncomfortable. I mean, like I think when it gets to a point where those traits stand between you and being able to live life to your full potential. I think that's what defines a disorder, so an eating disorder.
Hmm.
And that's another one of those labels, like ASD, autism spectrum disorder, that I just completely disagree with because I think if you were able to embrace your autistic traits and I guess use the autism to live a full life, like how is that even a disorder? Like it's allowing you to be in order.
Hmm.
But an eating disorder on the other hand, that prohibits you from living your full life. So I think that word disorder is very important. And for me that was a very important distinction to make in recovery was An eating disorder is a disorder. That is not who I am. It does not define me, and that's why I always say I had anorexia, rather than I was anorexic. And with autism, it's the complete opposite, right? I say I am autistic. I do not have autism, because autism is not something that like an eating disorder I can ever get rid of. It's part of my identity. It's part of who I am.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, so that's what I wanted to say, like, about how my neurodivergence affected my eating disorder, was those overlapping traits,
Hmm.
anxiety, um, and I mean, it's a coping mechanism, right? It creates predictability, it creates this false sense of safety,
And
and I
control, yeah.
think, yes, and I think that's why autistic people are more prone to eating disorders,
Hmm.
because we live in a world that is so unpredictable, that is so out of control. And then the last thing I also wanted to say was, I think, that interoception plays a very important role in autism and eating disorders. I've talked about interoception a bit in some of my recent podcast episodes and blog posts, but for anyone who doesn't know, interoception is the sense through which we monitor the inner state of our body. So whether you're too hot or too cold, whether you're hungry or thirsty, that's all regulated by interoceptive awareness. And neurodivergent people tend to lack interoceptive awareness, so we're not always as aware of whether we are hungry or whether we are cold. So growing up, like, I just remember not feeling physically hungry, in the sense of like, oh, your stomach is rumbling, or whatever. So I was like, well, if I'm not hungry, that was another thing, right, that you learn in school. If you're not hungry, don't eat. So I was
Yeah.
like, oh, simple as that. And so
Yeah.
I lost weight, and I know they're doing a lot of research now on, like, the relationship between autism and eating disorders, and what impact, like, traumatic birth has, and all this kind of stuff. But I was actually born 2 weeks late, but I had the weight of a premature baby. I was a very, very small child. And growing up, like, I was always the smallest one in the class. Like, I'm always in the front of all the school photos, because I was so small, and my nickname was Little Livia, and everything that had to do with being little. Um, so when I, like, just didn't eat when I wasn't hungry, and I also cut out, like, these so-called bad foods that I learned were unhealthy, like, I just lost a little bit of weight, and that was, like, already enough to, I think, put me into energy deficit and
Hmm.
make me develop an eating disorder. And yeah, like I mentioned before, I think all the forced treatment, like saying you have to do this, basically trying to take away the very thing that I believed was giving me control,
Yeah.
made me cling to that thing even more, which
Exactly. Yeah. It actually is counterproductive.
yes, which extended the duration and increased the, I guess, severity of my eating disorder. And of course, I can never look back in time. I can never know what if, like, and I feel like that's counterproductive too. It's like, what if this was different? Because you can never go back. You can only go forward. But
Hmm.
I truly believe that if I would have known about being autistic, and if that would have been accepted and worked with and accommodated during my eating disorder, I think that my eating disorder would not have become as bad as it was, as it
Yeah.
ended up becoming. I don't know if that resonates with you as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it became chronic, and I think that obviously, I mean, I think that accommodating my autistic traits and accepting myself for me would have helped in recovery, and obviously not becoming my eating disorder becoming chronic. But I mean, I guess the most important is that if I had been diagnosed with autism early in childhood, I may not even have had an eating disorder at all. Um, and that's
Yeah,
probably
I
even
think so
more
too.
important.
Yeah, yeah, it's hindsight is always 2020, but
Yeah.
at the same time, I always, like, people think I'm crazy when I say this, but I think developing my eating disorder and how my life's course went, I think it was the greatest gift, and I think it was supposed to happen that way,
Yeah.
because the work that I do now, helping other people overcome their eating disorders while embracing their neurodiversity, I wouldn't want any other life than this, because it's, I know I'm doing such important work, and it's so fulfilling, like,
It
seeing
is,
other
yes. Yeah,
people
it is.
get better and really discover who they are. And I don't think I would feel so strongly about knowing who I am and knowing my boundaries. I don't think I would be where I am, or I don't think I'd be who I am today if it weren't for really going through so many struggles and having to figure out so many obstacles. Because
Yeah.
ultimately, that's what makes us stronger.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. I mean, I can relate for myself as well. I mean, I wouldn't be where I am today if it wasn't for the struggles I had encountered. But I mean, who is to say that maybe my life wouldn't have been fulfilling if I didn't? But yeah, that's always in hindsight. You can speculate over everything, I guess. Um,
Right.
I was curious about, like, do you think that masking has maybe had an effect on your eating disorder or contributed to it in some way?
I do think so. Especially like what I was saying before about like trying to be like a normal girl, and like pretending to do all the things that I really didn't want to do. I think I think that is partially tied to anxiety. Like I was always so anxious in social situations, or really being in any kind of situation where I didn't feel safe. And I think anxiety, if you think about like our nervous system, anxiety, being in that state of like fight, flight, or freeze, like that shuts off physical hunger cues, and that makes it literally physically harder to eat. So I think that like already, the anxiety that came with masking already had an impact on like my physical state, which made it physically harder for me to eat. But I think also like mentally, trying to trying to fit a mold of who I wasn't supposed to be, like gives you this huge sense of like lack of control, right?
Hmm.
So it causes you to turn to other things that do give you that false sense of safety and control. And that is food and exercise. I mean, sometimes people turn to alcohol or drugs or other addictions, but when you're like 11, like what is super easy to access and super easy to control at that age is how you eat and how you move. So I definitely think masking did play a part in that as well.
Yeah, I can relate as well. I mean, I think that in hindsight, which is easy, obviously, but I think that not fitting in and being valid for who you are, and then you think, oh, maybe if I lose weight, I'll be accepted, and my social awkwardness won't matter as much. And I think that's an experience that's very common in autistic people.
Yeah, definitely.
Like like masking. I think that the eating disorder itself is a form of masking in some way.
I completely agree with that. Because I read one of Eckhart Tolle's books recently. I'm not going to get too deep into this, but I wrote another podcast episode script about something, and I actually use exactly that phrase in the episode of like the eating disorder is a mask for who you really are.
Yeah,
And when you are able to accept your autism, you no longer need that mask. But that's really scary because you're so used to wearing that
yeah.
mask. To
You
I
don't
mean,
know who you are anymore. And when you
right.
realize that you're autistic, you're like, okay, so what is the real me and what is the mask? And sometimes it's really, really hard to disentangle because I mean, it's so ingrained into yourself that the mask becomes who you think you are, and
Yeah.
so it's a lot of like unpacking and self-discovery, and sometimes even painful.
And I think that's also a huge part of the reason why it is so hard, for autistic people or for anyone in general to recover from an eating disorder, because you've you've correlated your identity to
Yeah,
that thing, and letting go of that like brings with it this sense of emptiness, this sense of lack of purpose,
yeah,
and not feeling that, like that is so scary. So we cling to what we know, we cling to what is safe. We act in alignment with how we identify. So if we identify as someone who needs an eating disorder, that's how we will continue to identify, and that's how we will continue to live. But
exactly.
I think that's also the very first step to living a free life, is saying I do not want to identify as this person anymore. I want to identify and fill it in how you want to identify. And I think that's the very first step to, like I said, discovering that free life. And that's why I don't really like the word recovery very much, is because I think when you identify as someone in recovery, you will act in alignment with someone in recovery. But when you act in alignment with someone in recovery and you keep acting as someone in recovery, you will stay in recovery. But again, that's not the point. Like, the point is to be free, to be recovered, to be out of
Yeah.
recovery. So I think that's the approach I take with working one-on-one with clients, is saying, like, let's not focus on doing recovery a certain way. Let's focus on who are you at your core? Who do you want to be? How do you
Yeah.
want to identify? And build on that, because that is so much more productive
And
than,
not listen to what society tells you is normal. Just be yourself and just
yes,
stop caring what people think of you.
yes,
If you're weird, if you're awkward, then so be it. Be proud of it. Embrace it.
yeah, yeah. Exactly.
So, what few words of wisdom or recommendations would you give to neurodivergent people struggling with an eating disorder that still needs more guidance?
Yeah, so first of all, I'd recommend that you are not bad, you are not weird, you are not weak for struggling with an eating disorder as a neurodivergent individual. That's like the first thing I want to say, is that your struggles are so valid. And you are sick enough, and you are not too complex, or any of these labels that anyone has told you. And full recovery, like, I know this is gonna sound so cliche, but full recovery, being recovered and living a life of freedom in and without restriction, is 100% possible for you. And when it comes to achieving that life and getting there, I think it's so important to give yourself permission that your journey is not going to look the same way as it is going to look for someone who is neurotypical. You have a very different brain. You are unique, which means the approach you are going to take to discovering and unleashing your full potential is also going to look unique. And for me, a huge part of, well, basically the most important part of becoming fully recovered from my eating disorder was to stop trying to fit the mold of what I believed recovery looked like. So,
Yeah.
because for so long I believed, like, I can only be fully recovered if I no longer have certain preferences or certain routines or sensory needs around food, right? But of course, that was chasing something that didn't even exist, because
You
that's who I am.
essentially chasing the neurotypical idealizing of
Which is
recovery,
which
which is not for autistic people.
impossible. Which actually, like, I don't use the word impossible a lot, but like, that is actually impossible.
Yeah.
So yeah,
And it's
I'd
actually
recommend.
harmful as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Chasing something that isn't good for you is obviously harmful.
Yeah, yeah, so that's the definition. Yeah, so I'd say, like, allow yourself to embark on a journey that is unique to you. And if you feel like you're really struggling with feeling understood and feeling seen and feeling heard, because I mean, most treatment professionals do not understand autism, especially when it comes to eating disorders. I would recommend finding someone or working with someone who does understand, who has lived experience, because I personally believe lived experience is the most powerful qualification for any kind of help or support.
Mhm.
So yeah, I mean, if people want to learn more about me and the work I do, you can find me on my website, livelabelfree.com. And I basically have everything there. But yeah, I mean, I think it all comes down to giving yourself permission to
Mhm.
be yourself without labels.
Yeah.
And that's also my whole philosophy of Live Label Free. I believe any kind of restriction is rooted in labels, right? Whether we label food as good or bad causes us to restrict certain foods. Labeling behavior as something we should or shouldn't do causes us to only do the things that we feel we should do, even though the things we say we shouldn't do are maybe the very things that we actually want to do. So yeah, giving yourself permission to be yourself, to be the full unique version of you, because the world only has one you, and
And
trying
it
to be
needs
someone
one you
else
as well.
is a waste. Yes, exactly. So yeah,
So
thank you so much, Lawrence, for having me on this podcast.
thank you very much for being on the podcast. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. All right, bye-bye. How powerful was that conversation? I'd love to continue it with you. Did you resonate with any of the experiences I described? What were your biggest insights? Let me know your thoughts by sending me an email at livlabelfree@gmail.com or simply submit your message via the contact form on my website by visiting the link livlabelfree.com/contact. And if you're interested in buying my cookbook, Nourishing Neurodiversity, and being the first one to know when my memoir Rainbow Girl comes out, be sure to visit the Books tab on my website to learn more. And of course, if you want to get those books for free, you can join me on Patreon by visiting the link livlabelfree.com/Patreon. I hope to chat with you soon, and otherwise, I'll catch you in the next episode. Bye-bye for now.
Just 1 foot in front of the other, and you'll see around the corner soon.
This podcast has been recorded by your host, Liv. This podcast has been edited by my wonderful friend, Dharma, and the beautiful song, 1 Foot in Front of the Other, that you are now listening to was written and recorded by my beautiful mom, Louise Alexandra. I am so grateful for my team and everyone who supports Liv Label Free. Together, we are always stronger.